Good afternoon, everyone. This is Boots GEOTINA-GARCIA, your host and moderator for today's interesting lecture. So I'm also a member of the MOP Arts and Culture Committee. And today we are fortunate to have with us a lecture with the title From Grassland to Metropolis, the evolution of the Makati CBD. And we are also fortunate to have as our guest architect PAULO G. ALCAZAREN, environmental planner and landscape architect and principal PGAA creative design. Today's lecture is a project of the MAP Arts and Culture Committee. And so we'd like to ask everyone to please settle down as we are will be beginning our program. On behalf of the MAP Arts and Culture Committee, I would like to start the 7th of the first ever monthly MAP Arts and Culture lecture series. So to start with, I'd like to call on Mr. Eddie Yap, Chair of the MAP Arts and Culture Committee, to deliver his welcome remarks all the way from Vancouver at 2 o'clock in the morning. Thank you.
I'll be sleeping shortly. Thank you, Boots. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. Good afternoon, fellow MAP members and guests. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again. I hope you and your family members are well and safe. This past month has been horrible. There has been so much disruption to our lives and so much stress and anxiety. Many family members, friends, and MAP members got sick or passed away. Let us all have a moment of silent prayer for the recovery of the sick and repose of the souls of those who pass. A moment, please. Thank you. All of us are being bombarded with an endless stream of virtual meetings on a wide range of topics. It is for this reason that we in the MAP Arts and Culture Committee have been offering a different diet, a diversion, so to speak, from the relatively dreary news and serious topics. This Zoom meeting is also a nice occasion to see many of our good friends and colleagues and to greet them virtually. So hello again to all of you here. Late last year, we offered a series consisting of 3 concerts, which were part of past productions I did for the MAP. The first was a Flavor of Vienna concert, followed by Adeste Fideles concerts at Santuario de San Antonio and PICC Plenary Hall. This year, the MAP Art and Culture Committee, which I chair, has started a lecture series on arts and culture topics. The series has covered the following topics so far: Philippine contemporary art, to secure the past and the possible, and a virtual tour of the Metropolitan Museum of Manila on March 18 this year. It was followed by Pampango High Cuisine on April 21, featuring Chef Jean Gonzalez, President of Center for Asian Culinary Studies and Chef Patron of Cafe Isabel. Next, on May 19, we had Original Filipino Music, or OPM, lecture and demonstration featuring Professor Felipe Jun de Leon. He is the former chair of the National Commission for Culture and Arts, or NCAA, and presently he's the head of NCAA's National Committee on Music. On June 16, we had a virtual tour of the National Museum covering the Museum of Anthropology, Fine Arts, and Natural History. That was followed by investing in art and rare collectibles, the view from the auction room, featuring Mr. Ramon Richie Lerma, co-founder, chair, and chief specialist of Salcedo Auctions. Last August, we had a very popular and well-attended lecture on heritage and ancestral homes. I think I'm getting sleepy. Featuring Ms. Joby Acusar, the Corporate Marketing Director of Las Casas Filipinas de Acusar, and Mr. Dexter Manansala, the Arts and Culture Director. This was very well attended and elicited many questions that our resource speakers graciously answered. We hope to organize a group tour to Las Casas de Acusar when conditions permit. Today's topic and the seventh of the series is From Grassland to Metropolis, Evolution of Makati CBD, featuring renowned environmental planner and landscape architect PAULO ALCAZAREN. He will tell us the amazing story of the evolution of the Makati Grassland to a business center with satellite residential communities. This particular lecture is timely in that there is a very controversial project that is hitting the social media, and Paulo Alcazaren will be most likely tell us something about that. I'm referring to Parex, the proposed
Pasig River.
skyway along Pasig River. For our forthcoming events for the rest of the year, our committee is working on the following areas and topics: Philippine history, Broadway music, Philippine dance, and Kaiseki Japanese cuisine. So please watch out for announcements of the upcoming event of the MAP Arts and Culture Committee. Thank you, Architect Paulo, for being with us this afternoon to share with us your time and expertise. Thank you, everyone, for signing in, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Eddie, and good morning.
Yes.
Should you wish, you can
Thank
now
you.
go to bed.
Yeah. Now I can go back to bed. Thank
But
you.
perhaps you should listen to Paulo as well.
Take it away, Butch.
Thank
You
you.
can ably handle this.
Okay, Ed. Thank you. Thank you for keeping awake. Before we hear Paulo, I'd like to give some reminders for the audience. First, as participants, you are automatically muted and your camera or video is also turned off. You also may submit your questions through the Q&A box that you see, of course, on the screen on your chat box. And with the assistance of our secretariat, I will ask the questions on your behalf. You will not be able to see the speakers. I'm sorry, you will be able to see the speakers, but you will not be able to view the other participants. And in line, of course, with our policy, we like to keep our introduction safe and dispense with a lengthy introduction. So with that, I'd like to call on our speaker, environmental planner and landscape architect and principal, PGAA Design. Let's all welcome Architect Paulo G. Alcazaren. Paulo?
Thank you, Boots, and thank you, Eddie, and thank you to Management Association of the Philippines for having me this afternoon to be able to share with you a very interesting story of the evolution of Makati's CBD and its context of the larger metropolis that is our crazy Manila. Let me share my screen. I'm PAULO ALCAZAREN, principal of PGAA Creative Design, where environmental planners, urban designers, and landscape architects. And let's get straight to the story of Makati CBD from Grassland to Metropolis. And I always start my talks on cities in the Philippines going back to when the urbanism started over 300 years ago. And Intramuros set a template for urbanism within a grid of quadricula set by the laws of the Indies. And our towns and cities evolved in the succeeding centuries based on this template. And distinctively, the template had plazas, the social open spaces, were the locus of economic, political, and social life. These central urban spaces defined by buildings of importance, church and state, as well as the residences of the upper classes. The late 19th century Manila and its arrabales or suburbs is shown here, which include San Nicolas, Tondo, Binondo, Santa Cruz, Quiapo, San Miguel, Sampaloc, Ermita, Malate, and Papo. And the total population before the Americans came was only 250,000. And the population of the entire Philippines is less than the population of NCR today. It was only 12 million Filipinos. And Manila itself, the urban development stayed within a tranvia ride from the center, and the central business district was, of course, across the bridge of Spain, which is Binondo. So what happened, and I quickly transitioned into the American period after the Philippine-American War and American-Spanish War, and the payment of $20 million for the territories that America took over, including the Philippines. American colonial or insular government thought it best to create a new plan for Manila as the capital of their farthest colonial holding. So this is the 1905 Burnham City Beautiful Plan of Manila, which Daniel Burnham planned for 800,000 people as its carrying capacity, showing a rational grid of streets based on trends in urbanism that started in the mid-19th century in cities like Paris and which is done by Haussmann, Alphonse Alfand, and the urbanism of the Spanish cities like Madrid and Barcelona of Ildefonso Cerda. Burnham had studied all of these and started a movement for urban planning in the United States based on the tenets of the City Beautiful, which he had applied to the Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago and in the 1901 Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. Daniel Burnham brought along an associate to create the plans for Manila and Baguio, and after that, shortly after that, gave the responsibility of the translation of the plan to William Parsons, who stayed a couple of years until the 1910s, and he turned over the reins of urban planning of Manila and the cities and towns in the Philippines to American-trained Filipinos, starting with Juan Herediano and Tomas Mapua. This is Manila's master plan of 1905, showing the central area. That was a virtual mirror of Washington, D.C.'s Macmillan Plan by Burnham, Charles McKean, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and the sculptor Augusto St. Gaudens. And you can see the similarities of the master plan with the Central National Mall. Instead of the Rizal Monument, in Washington, of course, had the much taller Washington Monument, but the width is the same. The length is about 1/3 of Washington, and instead of the Potomac, we had the fabulous Manila Bay, which Burnham had stipulated should be conserved because that's one of the natural beauties of the situation of Manila, which he said had a bay as beautiful as Naples and canals as grand as the ones in Venice. This is Washington, D.C., and we were supposed to have a Capitol building at the end of the Baroque axis from the National Monument. And this is the design of that Capitol building, which was never completed. But if we had built it, it would have cost only 10 million pesos at the time. So it's not only Manila that was provided with master plans. Master plans were prepared for Baguio, Zamboanga, Cebu, and others. And master plans and patterns for physical development, albeit centralized in Manila, and the Bureau of Public Works were created from 1918 onwards, mostly by Filipino architects trained in the US, as I mentioned before, Arellano, Toledo, and others. And despite the master plan only being partially completed because of a transition in political regimes from Republican to Democrat in the United States, and effectively the abandonment of the project of this far colony of the Philippines, Manila was provided with key infrastructure and landmarks like the post office and Jones Bridge, both by Arellano. In fact, the third building here is the Metropolitan Theater, the Art Deco masterpiece of the early 1930s, also by Juan Arellano. And the green that you see there is the Mahan Gardens. Now, Manila was as beautiful as Paris. Actually, this is not Paris. This is actually Manila. This is Paris, and this was Manila in the 1930s with a tramway system run by Meralco that at its peak carried 7 million passengers. So we had a environmentally friendly mass transport system as well as a very good and walkable city. So we've forgotten how to build our cities, and today we have to rediscover that lost art. This is a favorite poster of mine from right before the war, when Manila was a pearl of the Orient, the choice for cruise ships and airlines. At the time, Hong Kong and Singapore were just backwaters. So this is Manila as it was getting congested by the mid-1930s, with a population already approaching 700,000, very near the capacity that Burnham had set in his physical plan of 1905. And the Commonwealth government of Manuel L. Quezon planned to move the capital in anticipation of further growth and eventual independence. So that's Intramuros, the Jones Bridge, Binondo, Arroceros, Santa Cruz, Quiapo, and the far open space you see there is the UST. So what happened was that the Philippine government, the Commonwealth government, decided to move the capital 15 kilometers inland, 15 kilometers being the maximum range of battleships, to protect the future capital of the future independent Philippines from attack. Of course, they did not anticipate aerial bombing. And so this shows the 15-kilometer line, which coincidentally is the line of EDSA. And this is the 1941 Frost-Arellano plan for Quezon City, also a city beautiful plan, but much larger, prepared by an associate of William Parsons, Harry Frost, who took over when Frost passed away in 1939. And he was assisted by Juan Arellano in preparing this master plan, the 1941 version of the master plan of Quezon City. In fact, the city in the Greater Manila area has had about 12 master plans prepared since the first one of improvements by the Spanish government late in the Spanish colonial era in the 1880s, in terms of the port expansions and improvements to the street network with the tram systems implemented. So this is the 1941 Frost-Arellano Croft plan for Quezon City, showing the line of EDSA and a central area defined by a large 400-hectare quadrangle, which was going to be a 400-hectare park, at the apex of which was a 25-hectare circle or ellipse that was to contain the Congress and Senate of the Philippines, and on either side the New Malacanang, which is now the Veterans and the Halls of Justice, which is now the SSS building. And Quezon Boulevard was to connect it with the old core of Manila, and the green area to the right and above the ellipse was a 1,000-hectare property that was to be conserved as green that would house the University of the Philippines. So what happened? They actually started the 1941 plan. This is a aerial picture of the Diliman Triangle, and UP started. I'm sorry, it's going to take just a little more to get to Makati, but this is grounding for why Makati happened. This is right before the war. You can see the ellipse at the top, and you can see just a faint tracing of the University of the Philippines with the first two buildings designed by Juan Arellano, already constructed and completed before Pearl Harbor happened. So North Avenue, East Avenue, West Avenue, and South, and that was supposed to be a 400-hectare park, larger than Central Park in the United States, and the whole new city of capital city of Quezon City was supposed to be built around that. But what happened? War. This is the Philippine Army under Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur, and this is a 500-pound bomb on its way to Intramuros. And the damage from the war, everybody knows Manila was the most devastated next to Warsaw. And what happened to the buildings and infrastructure that was built before the war was lost. Instead of giving us all enough money to rebuild, the Americans thought it better to abide by the promise. They gave us independence, and Filipinos were happy. And the Americans threw in a couple of thousand jeeps, which became our jeepneys. Manila and key cities were heavily damaged in the war. The U.S. aids in rebuilding with funds for key government buildings, only mostly in the center and in certain chief cities like Cebu and Baguio, and the U.S. lands planners, as well as personnel from the U.S. Bureau of Roads to assist the National Urban Planning Commission and the Bureau of Public Works, which was headed by an American, Lewis Croft, who was detained in UST and freed. This is him, a Harvard alumni, Lewis Croft, with fellow Harvard graduates Antonio Cayanan and Alcenmo Alquinto, formed the National Urban Planning Commission, eventually, which became the Capital Planning Commission, and eventually also the National Planning Commission, which is the precursor of what is today the DSHUD. Planning was centralized. We only had a handful of planners, but what they also did in 1949 was to study the possible capitals other than Manila, because they were already conscious of the criticism that Manila was not equally distant from everywhere else and the rest of the Philippines. So they looked at 16 other possible locations from Baguio, Novaliches, Quezon City, even Camp McKinley, Tagaytay, which actually had a plan for a summer capital, as well as places like Santo Tomas, Lipa, Cebu, Iloilo, and Davao. They even looked at the geographical center of the Philippines, which they were told was Boracay. Unfortunately, Boracay did not have any power or transport, and so they eventually chose Novaliches. So the 1941 plan eventually led to the 1949 Capital City Plan by Arellano, Croft, and Alquinto, with revisions, iterations in 55, 56, 58, and 59 by the National Planning Commission, showing, and please remember this, that the plan of government was to move all of the government offices to a national government center, which is the new Malacanang, the new capital, which is Congress and Senate, a new justice complex in a triangle around a 25-hectare plaza of the Republic, in front of which was a 95-meter wide avenue of the Republic. And on both sides of that central avenue, please remember this very carefully, we're supposed to have transferred all of the commercial establishments from Binondo, or the old central business district. And enough space was put in here to be able to transfer all of those buildings. And behind that were supposed to be residential enclaves for civil government workers, as well as the general public for a very rationally put together capital of the Philippines. So it had a CBD, it had a government center, it had a reservoir with water, and in fact, it also had the Quezon City International Airport, as well as an athletic center in the 400-hectare National Central Park. Because the ellipse was turned into the Quezon Memorial, the Philippines University of the Philippines still retained its open space, and there was even a national cemetery and national cathedral. But also very important, as early as 1949, planners advised and told government that the limits of growth was the Marikina Valley, because they already had the report from the UP Department of Geology as to the extent of the fault line, and so they recommended that the whole of the Marikina Valley be conserved as open space, also for agrarian use, as well as a limit to growth, and practical extension of the city was in and around that Avenue of the Republic, as well as infill between Quezon City and the old Manila. So unfortunately, nothing much happened. There was a lot of problems in the Philippines. We didn't have money. This is EDSA and rush hour in 1955. So in fact, in Quezon City, very little of the wonderful plans prepared from 49, 55, 56, 58, and 59 were ever built, except for the framework of what was supposed to be the Congress of the Philippines, which stayed a framework after 2 million pesos was spent, and the rest of the money went missing. And so very little infrastructure was built for Quezon City. In the 50s and 60s, and the planned central business district that I explained to you was never built in Novaliches. And this is where Makati steps in. Sorry for that long intro, but I had to tell it because it has a lot of important aspects, especially in terms of the physical plan and layout. So as the new capital, Quezon City was not being developed adequately. Makati offered close to 1,650 hectares. It's an alternative for residential, industrial, and commercial development, leaving the civic functions to Manila and Makati. And this template has been followed by all of the subsequent large-scale development by different developers all around our expanding metropolis. So the failure of government to provide and build a capital city with its own CBD and everything else necessary led to the success of private development because of, I'm sorry to say, the ineptitude of national government to provide all of these basic needs. So stepping back into the late Spanish period, just slightly as to the origins of the estate, it used to belong to Captain Pedro de Brito and the Jesuits, because the Jesuits were thrown out of the country, as some of you may know. It was bought by Jose Bonifacio Rojas, a partner of Ayala y Compañía, in 1851, and eventually the hacienda was inherited by Jacobo Alfonso and Mercedes Ayala de Rojas in 1911. The hacienda was mainly agricultural, but pottery and clay bricks for construction were also made here. The area also was the source of another building material, very important to Manila, which is adobe. In fact, a lot of Manila was built by adobe from Makati. And another product that Makati yielded, of course, was the grasslands that from which the title of this talk comes from. Although rice was grown in the haciendas, the yields were disappointing because essentially it was a swamp. The hacienda was more successful growing fodder grass, or what's called zacate, which fed the horses that pulled the tranvias, which was initially a Zobel franchise, as well as the calesas and most transport in 19th century Manila. So these are pictures of the original Zobel franchise omnibuses or horse-drawn tranvias on rails in Escolta. Over there. Makati in the early 20th century was a hacienda town of 3,000 people by the Pasig River, and it's a company town, Ayala y Compañía. This is how the Pasig looked like and still looks like, except maybe in a few years it will be all covered up by a proposed Pasig River Expressway. And this is the central area, which is the Poblacion. That's the Church of Peter and Paul. And the open space is roughly where the old international school was, or where I believe some of the commercial establishments are today. That's Kalayaan. This is the hacienda, the main house of Ayala y Compañía. And Kalayaan Avenue was in fact the easement for the rail line that connected Manila to Fort McKinley. Yes, you could take a train from central Manila to Fort McKinley and onwards to Pasig and onwards in fact to Marikina and even to the foothills of Antipolo, which is a popular destination because of the pilgrimage to the church there. So we had a viable rail-based transport system that did not require car-based transport of goods, products, and people. So this is we look at the use of the hacienda in the 1930s, and it was a lot of land, and a new technology of air travel came in, and so the rails also brought urban development, and the first subdivisions of the Ayalas were in fact built before the war in 1926. That's the racetrack, that's Pasig River. These are the first subdivisions, which were Olympia and Consuelo, very simple cutting up of lots in fairly longish blocks that had access to the rail. So this followed the models of cities like Los Angeles in California that had rail connections to the main city. So people lived here and took the rail transport to Manila for jobs. But the rest of the development saw the building of the 43-hectare Nielsen Airport. And the airfield operated from 37 to 41, and after the war, from 46 to 48. It was closed in 48 when the government consolidated all civilian air operations in Nichols Field. So the Ayala Company embarked on real estate development to service post-war growth, as well as the opportunity presented by the inability of government to build Quezon City and offer a viable options for the expansion of commercial business and residential development in a city that was booming because of post-war refugees as well as migration, which is migration for the provinces, and the rebuilding of the Philippines. The first Makati zoning, this is a very rough graphic from a report by the Philippine Institute of Architects in 1961 that featured the planning of Makati, that showed that Makati was not just commercial and residential. In fact, Makati, before EDSA was fully developed and the industrial estates along the Pasig River were built, it offered a more viable area for relocation of industrial or light industrial establishment. So the brown, the violet area is the industrial area, which was proximate to the PNR rail line. The brown area were the additional subdivisions that the Ayala Company developed before and after the war, while the yellow is the controlled housing area using modern, at the time, modern templates for suburban development that followed the Garden City tenets of development, as well as a central area. Now, this is where the previous reference to the Central Avenue, on either side of which was supposed to be the commercial, the commercial buildings transferred from Binondo, was replicated. And in fact, Makati offered essentially the same template that the Quezon City Plan of 49 had presented but never produced, which was a Central Avenue. Here, instead of the Avenue of the Republic, we had the Ayala Avenue, and on both sides of which was enough space for all of the commercial establishments in Binondo to transfer, behind which were residential areas, which was also planned for Novaliches in the Quezon City 49, 55, and 56 plans, but was never provided with the infrastructure that the Ayala Corporation actually built. And so this is a further evolution of the Makati, showing in slightly more detail the various villages in the phases that the company had built, and as well as the relationship to the rest of Manila in terms of EDSA connection, as well as the PNR link. So Makati's planners were influenced in the late 1940s and early 1950s in the design of residential zones by the garden suburb planning movement, espoused by planners like Olmsted, John Nolan, Warren Manning, and the rest, as well as post-war guidelines prescribed by groups like the Urban Land Institute. So this was a very much used guidebook in the United States as suburban development happened. Of course, there's lots of criticism about the flight to the suburbs, but this became the template for the various villages all around Makati, as seen here: Forbes Park Village South, with a central area for supermarket and church. But of course, it was not all a overnight success. In fact, land values in 1956 show that properties, Forbes was not the most expensive property. It was actually Lourdes subdivision. For those of you who don't know where this is the subdivision right in front of Lourdes Hospital, near the Mandaluyong Bridge, near Talento. And believe it or not, that was the highest costing residential property in 1956. Of course, all that all changed as Makati further evolved and as the CBD commercial buildings started to flow into Ayala Avenue. So you see here Jupiter, Bel Air 4, and the rough grading and tracing of the roads for the residential developments all the way to Palm Village. And the industrial area was, of course, Buendia, and the first buildings were along Pasong Tomo before Ayala fully happened. And you can see some of the warehouses, which today has been all redeveloped into multi-tower mixed-use, but mostly residential complexes, as is when you shift. And as the industrial establishments move from Buendia and Pasong Tomo further south to beyond Metro Manila and to Laguna and Batangas. So this is another picture showing Pasong Tomo, which is now being redeveloped into mixed-use developments. So this is the chronology of the villages. In fact, San Lorenzo property was more expensive than Forbes. Of course, the lot cuts were much smaller. The 1950s see the introduction of modernist architecture in office and industrial buildings in Makati, as well as new building types. The aircon building looked like an aircon. And we saw the introduction of these new things, apartment buildings and condominiums. This is the Monterey Apartments by Leandro Locsin in 1959. And these are the first buildings. That's by Felipe Mendoza. We had a lot of car displays. This is the corner of Buendia and Pasong Tomo. And Makati's development in the 50s and 60s led to the flourishing of the golden age of modernist architecture and planning in the country. Many of these buildings were featured in local and international publications, very wonderful modernist buildings. And this is a generation of Filipino architects who were the creative force behind this wave of modernism. Formosa, Luz, Arguelles, Fajardo, Manyosa, Nakpil, Luis Arden, all proudly Filipino, all at the cutting edge of modern architecture, not just in the Philippines, but in Asia. Today, Filipino architects have to play second fiddle to foreign consultants who come in and just regurgitate their old designs from overseas. And we're happy to accept that as modern architecture today. So we have Cesar Concho, Jose Zaragoza, Juan Akpil, national artist Lindy Locsin, as well as Ildefonso Santos, my old boss who I worked for. all contributing to Makati of the 60s and 70s. This is the Insular Life in 61 by Cesar Poncio, the AM by Gabriel Famoso, the original Ayala Museum by Lindy Locsin. And this is that Central Avenue, on originally the only area where the commercial buildings were supposed to be built, because Ayala didn't anticipate that they would be so successful that the two areas behind were still residential areas. Eventually, of course, this all changed because as buildings, especially the banks, eventually transferred their headquarters and everyone else followed, they decided to change the Legazpi and Salcedo villages. That's why there were villages, is originally they were residential. In fact, the infrastructure took a few decades to be retrofitted for commercial building requirements. And that's the reason why you had so much problems getting a phone line in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Legazpi and Salcedo, because it was really meant to be residential. And we had a consolidation of the commercial center in a dedicated area to avoid the problems that Divisoria and Claro Recto had faced by the 50s and 60s of overcrowding and blight. This is the aerial panorama of 1970 according to the master plan. So the success of Makati came in the strategy to follow a master plan, to adopt the master plan as things change, and to impose a strict planning regimen that was policed by the formation of a very strong building association. There was a industries association, and there was a building owners administration, which eventually became MASEA. And that's one of the reasons of the success of the CBD, a lesson that's copied in BGC by BGCEA, in fact in Ortigas by Okay. So this is Ayala in the 70s. It becomes a Wall Street of Greater Manila on both sides of Ayala. It was a single zone, and what the problem was until the 1990s is that after 6 o'clock, everything was dead. But that was changed. That has been changed over the last few decades because of the introduction of call centers and mixed-use development. This is the Makati Commercial Center, which was a huge success because it ensured safety and convenience of having everything with 4 large parking areas, and the inside was actually pedestrian. So this is a picture from the Ayala archives of the commercial center, the Zulu Hotel by the Manyosa brothers, and the Ayala Avenue buildings coming up. Of course, technology at the time limited the height of skyscrapers to 12 stories because of the seismic requirements, but that has since been exceeded because of new technology and engineering. But another thing is that it was quite a variety of amenities and offerings that enticed investors and people to move into Makati and the surrounding villages, including SM Department Store and Rizal Theater. And the commercial center was patterned after those in the United States, but with the pedestrian shopping arcades, as was the trend also in the United States in certain areas, and pedestrianized streets. Another thing that made Makati distinctive was the introduction of modern public art with sponsors and people pushing for it, like IP Santos and of course the Sabels and Lindy Locsin himself. This is the Glorieta and the Quad when it was still open air. And success was defined in the 1960s as an executive job. So this shows the transition from Binondo to Makati in the 60s. And this is evidenced by the shift of advertising to focus on Makati as the premier district. And this is Rizal Theater selling cars. And future Makati became the aspirational goals for the youth. These are the Insular Life Scholars in 1969, as well as the 10 outstanding young men who often post on Ayala Avenue. Makati was a favorite fashion shoot location in the 60s and 70s, as shown here. But the 80s led, of course, to the dark era of martial law, and the CBD was used as a venue for a prelude to people power. But post people power, then came the two spurts of growth from grass to glass, and Makati developed further to establish itself as the nation's premier district, as most of the banks had transferred their head offices to Makati, and Legazpi and Salcedo villages were starting to fill in with additional commercial establishment. And if you had a business like my own first office, we had to make sure that the address was Makati, and for us it was Paseo de Roas or Ayala Avenue. In fact, that it still is one of the targets of a lot of businesses to have that address. So since 2000, Makati has changed into a 24/7 mixed-use district as a shift in trends from single-use to mixed-use happened. And it supports vibrant urban life with aspects of culture and green space in the two original parks, Salcedo and Legazpi villages. The parks being the original green spaces, what was originally intended as residential areas. But fortunately, we have those. And in fact, we were myself and my company are still involved with Masaya in open space and streetscape improvements to the CBD, which has very high quality, well-maintained urban design ensured by the Proactive Owner Association or Masaya, residential village associations, and very good working collaborations with Makati LGU. So infrastructure has been upgraded to 21st century standards in the last 2 decades, and we've been lucky to be involved with a good number of our fellow consultants to assist Masaya and building owners to ensure that the quality of the urban design and planning has secured property values and made Makati attractive as a destination for business establishments and now, of course, residential development. So we've been involved with Masaya since the late 90s in the pedestrian and open space improvements, learning from the original evaluation by Ayala and Masaya on the problems of car-based development. Some of you may remember in the 1980s, it took 40 minutes just to cross from Legazpi to Salcedo village or to get to your restaurant in the commercial center. And planners in Ayala pointed to the fact that we had to put in pedestrian systems and improve it. And so my company was called in to look at it. We evaluated the walkability of Makati, and we suggested improvements, which we designed. It was approved by Masaya, and we built the system starting 2 decades ago and continuing till today for the upgrading of all pedestrian walkways to the standards set by Singapore and Hong Kong, granite pavers, weather protection when previously there was none, elevated walkways, these designed by Leandro Locsin and Associates, and we coordinated with the entire system upgrade. We designed the improvements, including this in the last 3 years, the creation of urban patios to improve the walkability and the crossing of corners, which if you walk, Makati used to have to take in corners as much as 60 meters just to get across. And so we incorporated bump outs without compromising the throughput of motor vehicles. We've been able to make it a more comfortable proposition for pedestrians. So everybody now walks. A lot of people love this. You don't have to take your car crossing. And we started first with 3 of these urban patios. We designed another 6, and we have plans for another half dozen more to improve pedestrian connectivity. And we won an award 2 years ago from the Design Center of the Philippines for placemaking for these interventions. So this is De La Rosa, and that's the improvement because of the original focus on car-based infrastructure, and now a refocus on pedestrian and non-motorized transport. And of course, open spaces, the conservation of what we had in and still have in Legazpi and Salcedo villages. And of course, the residential villages still maintain the large green open spaces. And the fact that Central Business District of Makati is surrounded by residential district with very mature forest cover, that means tree cover, it mitigates the urban heat island effect, which makes it different from several other CBDs, even in the region. So coming full circle, this is the Circuit Makati in the site of the original race course and beside the original Ayala y Compañía subdivisions of Consuelo and Olympia. And Makati city government is embarking on a full program of urban design improvements, hopefully that will see fruition in a post-pandemic scenario. But aside from that, my company and myself, we've been offering unsolicited suggestions for improvements for intermodal connectivity, this one in Guadalupe, which could be developed like this. I mean, if Mr. Ang would throw a few hundred million here, that's all it costs to improve connectivity and the lives of more people, as more expressways will not aid in solving the transport problem because of the principle of induced demand. So Makati was a product of historical factors of our post-independence trajectory, identifying needs and providing rational alternatives that have evolved in the last century. So it was a private initiative, but there's a lot to learn from both private and public management of urban areas, and it continues to reshape itself. So you must have a plan, you must be flexible, you must understand what people need to live, work, and play. But we also need to understand that no matter how well we plan our enclaves, us being a middle and upper class demographics, if we don't look at the larger context of Metro Manila and in fact all of the metropolitan areas in the Philippines, without improving that larger context, we will be stuck forever, a seas of wealth in oceans of want. And so we look at Metro Manila, which is over 600 square kilometers. Obviously, planning is not a priority and there's no urban space. And what we need to focus on in the new normal is really, and this has to be in the agendas of those who vote for, who you should vote for next year, housing, hospitals, mobility, and open space. Because if we don't have housing, our housing backlog is always 5 to 6 million nationwide compared to say Hong Kong or Singapore. And Hong Kong and Singapore just themselves, and just comparing Metro Manila, have built approximately 1 million public housing units since the 1960s for each of them, all aligned with mass transport, service utilities, infrastructure first before you build this thing, with access to markets, hawker centers, schools, public open spaces, and parks. So what do we have to do in the new normal? We have to build 6 times what Singapore or Hong Kong built in the last 50 years, 6 times by tomorrow, just to catch up with the backlog. That's the immensity of the problem that faces us. But unless we take the first step, we are not going to get anywhere near what even will start us back on the road to normalcy. And that includes hospitals, and our hospitals are never distributed evenly. We don't have enough, and they're not easily accessible by mass transport. And open space, compared to Singapore, which has 320 parks and 2,500 hectares of parks, giving 60 square meters of open space per person. Metro Manila only has 200, giving us 1 square meter or 1/9 of the minimum requirement that the World Health Organization has set for livable cities. So, and another example we have to follow is what Iloilo has done in the last 8 years, which is to embrace the river, add parks and open spaces. This is what we designed for Iloilo. And we're now in phase 9. And the biggest takeaway is that public property values beside the esplanade have grown 4 to 5 times since we opened the first phase. So not only that, we've also put in, the city has put in, it's not just us, but the entire city is proactive with its planning department in creating the Esplanade, as well as the most extensive parks and open space and biking network in the whole Philippines. So when the pandemic happened, Iloilo was one of the only areas that was able to provide alternative modes of transport for everyone. So we built Aquino Avenue also with dedicated bike lanes, and we completed it in 10 months. This is how it looked at the start. This is how it looks on bike day. Bike ridership has boomed, and of course now even more. So Iloilo is the bike capital and poster boy for non-motorized transport in the Philippines. And if we don't do all of this, if we don't address the problems of housing, hospitals, mobility, and open space, this is the future of Metro Manila if we do not plan for the future. Thank you and stay safe.
Okay. Thank you, Paulo, for that interesting discussion. You know, I thought it was really important for you to trace the history from the beginnings of.
Yeah, sorry it took a while, but you know.
Yeah, I think it was a very well, shall we say, it was important to mention it so that we would have a better understanding of the context. In fact, there's a very good, there's a comment that I see now in the QA from Maleli Morales, which says, thank you, Mr. ALCAZAREN and MAP. This is much appreciated. One of the most interesting sessions so far, despite the many informative learning programs. So I think the audience is quite.
And I left out all of the scandals and the chismes, which could have made a very interesting HBO
well, I will go into that in a while.
I didn't throw in the cabarets in Santa Ana, which is essentially in Makati. Anyway,
okay.
Go ahead.
Anyway, let me start. I don't see a question yet so far, but maybe in a while we'll have some. If I might just like to remind the audience, so please type your questions in the Q&A box. So I think I see a question. Okay, I will take care of that question. But in the meantime, I'd just like to ask you this question. If you were given the opportunity to master plan the CBD that you've spoken about, what would you have done differently?
Very interesting. In Makati?
Yeah, I'm talking about Makati, since you know the focus really of this discussion is Makati.
I think the whole adaptive reuse of the runways was something I cannot top. I mean, the opportunity was there, the infrastructure was already laid. It gave Makati a distinctive geometry, and I don't think I could have done a better job than Makniking in at least laying out the origin. Of course, and I haven't showed the various permutations of the plan, and the archives of Ayala Development has that. I cannot show in full nuance the adaptations that they made. Suffice it to say that of course, Makati CBD's evolution is a very good case study for planners and and urban development, also for public administration, because essentially it's its own government. Some Ayala executives have been quoted as saying.
Okay, so apart from the railway, anything else that you would have, capitalized on?
Yes, of course. The railway was something that Ayala's, even until the 1990s, had already was still eyeing as a possibility for networking with the suburbs of, say, Alabang, because they gave an unsolicited proposal to the government to build a commuter link between central Makati and the town south, including Alabang, of course. And this was based on transit-oriented development, which is a very rational and smart way to expand cities. But unfortunately, government, the arrangements with the PNR was just too messy. And so I believe the story was the Ayalas just abandoned it because of the difficulty in getting cooperation from national government to do so. A lost opportunity there. And in fact, until today, the rail connection, if if you ask me what I could have kept, it would be the Kalayaan Rail alignment to connect to McKinney. That would have solved, if we still had it, that would have
Yeah.
solved the connectivity of the two CBDs. Now that, of
Right.
course, the interests of Ayala and other companies in both CBDs are aligned. The big problem is connectivity, which has to be addressed by other means. And that needs creative solutions. I don't have the answers, but
Right.
has to be
Understand.
thought about. Yeah.
Okay. Now, again, there is a question here. Okay. I will be asking a related question to a question that I actually put together also. Seeing what Makati is today, what would you change? Of course, as a non-architect or urban planner, I see possibilities of more green zones, encouraging walking or biking, addressing the lack of parking, environmental concern, transportation options, which apparently you're already addressing through your initiatives with the
It's Masaya's initiatives, and I kudos to Ayala and all the members of Masaya that have made the success of its CBD, and the issues of connectivity are being addressed. Improvements. Masaya's and its members have put the money where their mouth is, and just on the pedestrian systems alone, it's an investment of close to 1 billion pesos over the last 20 years. And the non-motorized mobility within the CBD is the best in the country and up to the standards overseas. Of course, now the interface between Makati and the fabric of larger Manila is the challenge, which is being addressed with some complications, of course, with the overlapping or the several options for the subway connections, the interventions of private companies like MAGEO with its planned monorail from the Guadalupe to BGC. All of this, of course, again within a flawed government framework that has seen BGC transferred to Taguig when originally it was really Makati, and all of the problems attendant to having 17 different political regimes in Metro Manila. So you have tax environmental tax frameworks that are totally different as you cross one boundary to the other. It's not very good for business. I mean, if there were some sort of situation where an equivalent of Maceo can be had for the entire metropolitan area, then it's possible. But I'm not saying that we privatize everything, and it would be difficult for private developers to develop the civic consciousness, because that's really the job of government. So we cannot abandon, we cannot let government abandon its contract with people who paid taxes supposedly to get basic services and don't get any, either, well, give or take, depending on where you are in the metropolis, but the metropolitan governance itself is a joke. So nothing happened with the MMDA, which is totally powerless, in my opinion, and you can quote me on that. And so push comes to shove, we need to think beyond the boundaries of our CBDs and our private enclaves to get things done, and to align initiatives. How well-intentioned Mr. Ramon Ang is with his PAREX, I think, in my opinion, he was ill-advised on that, and there would be better ways to invest the 95 billion. But I'm not privy to what made him decide on that. Really, it has to be an open conversation. I do not have all of the answers. All I know is that in the context of quote-unquote traffic of Metro Manila, we need to address not traffic, which is just a symptom of the actual problem of the lack of a comprehensive mass transit, mass. It's moving people and not cars. And I do not say that we can blame private corporations for profit-based agendas because that's the reason they exist. But we do have to have a much larger and more altruistic context for everything that we do.
Okay, I have a series of questions which you might wish to answer. One question is, in fact, I think there was a comment made in the MAP community Viber. Why is the greenery at the Ayala Triangle getting smaller? Are there plans to add more structures? First question. And in fact, you were quoted or misquoted as, in relation to this tree issue. Would you like to respond to that?
The trees and the cutting of trees in certain,
right. And in
certain developments like Intercon
and what's the other one?
And the Mandarin.
At the Mandarin,
No, that's the reason why I gave the full story of and the history of the evolution of the CBD, Makati CBD, is to state that the parks were really the parks of the villages, and in fact they are all still there. The Ayala Triangle was never intended as an open space. It was an empty space until such time as the owners saw it fit to build on it. But they have retained the gardens in the center, and that's a good thing of them. Again, no one can blame private corporations for maximizing their holdings. Again, Makati, if you look at the history that I just mentioned, Metro Manila was supposed to still have that 400-hectare park in Quezon City, as well as, and I didn't show it, several other parks in the whole of Metro Manila, including portions of BGC today. There were intents to expand, and just didn't have time to do it. So we live in a metropolis of a lot of failed plans, and all of this gets lost in the way. And it's corporations like Ayala or even San Miguel are very easy targets. So I don't mean I have no ill intent myself, as well as other people who critique interventions such as the PAREX or other similar interventions. It's just that we would like to open the conversation and point all of these entities that have the finance and wherewithal to make real change, channel this money to something that we believe could be more sustainable and benefit a larger spectrum of people than and just what, say, expressways would benefit. All we want for those, and there are a lot of groups now putting together position papers. Tomorrow, the Institute of Environmental Planners are meeting to set a stand on PAREX. And really, it's trying to get all of our acts together, and what we want to do is really open the conversation with Mr. Ang and anybody else we know has the capacity to invest in real and sustainable change.
Okay, there actually also a related question is, what can you say about the Makati subway that has been long publicized but no construction?
Again, the problem is in a metropolis which has 17. See, a lot of people ask me, why can't Manila be planned? Is it a lack of political will? And my answer is, the problem is it has 17 political wills. And then you add the political wills of 9 agencies, so you have 20 plus political wills, and the political wills of the 5 or 6 large conglomerates that in fact have land holdings and financial backing larger than LGUs. Then you have about 30 political wills. So who's in charge of trying to get everyone together and come up with a singular plan? No, nobody is, and the avenue for that has been lost in complications of how our governance has evolved. Devolution in '91 to the cities, the problem of the Metro Manila Development Authority today, a lack of metropolitan governments. Metro Manila is the largest urban area in Asia that is not governed as a metropolis. It's governed as 17 kingdoms. When you have Metro Tokyo, Jabotabek, in Jakarta, although it's not that efficient, it's still managed as a metropolis. So they're trying. They have a better BRT. They already have a BRT that's somewhat working. We haven't. We don't have one that's working at all. So we have to really look at best practices and how we can get together instead of trying to pull each other down. And we don't mean to, those of us in various groups, we don't mean to pull large companies down, because we know they can support better and more sustainable initiatives.
Okay, actually, it's funny, but there are many questions, not only actually outside of the Makati discussion, and speaking about Metro Manila in a broader context. And there's a question here of why build an underground subway train in the flood-prone Metro Manila? That's one question. And there's also a related question on what can you say on future reclamation projects in Manila Bay?
First, subways, technology has improved. Engineering is really something else compared to even 10 years ago. And so subways are doable, and they are an option because of technology and engineering. And we have world-class engineers, and we can bring those with the experience of doing tunneling all across Asia, so long as it's within a context of a coordinated, comprehensive transport system. Then it can and should happen. And subways aren't the only solution. You have it will be a menu, a cocktail of interventions that include congestion pricing, that include carrot and stick solutions to car ownership, and so you have to engage everyone and ensure that everybody makes money on the private corporation side. But we could ensure that the growth of the metropolis is more managed, better managed than how it is today.
Okay.
And for the second question of reclamation, of course, no reclamation. It was the default of urban expansion in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the Philippines and Metro Manila seem to be picking up all of these debunked solutions, which cities all over the world have stopped doing. And we're still doing it because could be that the ones pushing the reclamation, of course. China became experts in reclaiming land for their coastal cities in the last 20 or 30 years because of a law that prevented cities from expanding inland so as to conserve agricultural land. That forced the Chinese to reclaim total area for their coastal cities larger than the size of Singapore. So they have the technology, and they're trying to do a bit of arbitrage by selling off this outdated technology to us and debunk technology of reclaiming, and telling us that that's one take on it. But the other is a real problem of reclamation seen as a better alternative in terms of land banking because of the problems of consolidating large areas of land from 100 owners. Again, because of the lack of a regimen of centralized planning. Unlike Hong Kong or Singapore, albeit Singapore, because it's a socialist country and they made a step 50 years ago to consolidate the property under the state, and also passed a law that allowed the state to consolidate land using eminent domain, which is a problem. So you have really a situation, again, because of fractured governance and low-hanging fruit offered by technologies, even though they are outdated and debunked. Again, can we blame corporations for leaning towards something that will make them a fast buck, and no matter what happens in the future, they still abide by it? Of course, they will say that there are interventions like engineering that can counter all of the negative aspects of reclamation, as a lot of the developers involved in reclamation state. But yes, but who pays for that? And the question has to be asked, does the cost accrue to the taxpayer and hence government, which is inefficient anyway to do anything? I don't think that's a wise way to do things. And if we can get to a point where we can have some sort of centralized planning with everyone's agreement, we have eminent domain, we can ensure that people get the value to the properties they already own, that we are not open to graft and corruption, that governance is metropolitan. There's so many things, and it's very complicated. I don't have the answers. I'm just giving you the options and asking the questions. Can it be done better for more people? And I don't like to dumb down any of these issues because they are complicated. Why do you think people from Harvard and MIT come to the Philippines to study Philippine urbanism? Because it's chaotic, because it's complex. It's very much simpler in their countries. There are cities and urban areas are much larger. And yet we fall all over ourselves trying to listen to them when they're in fact trying to listen to us. And solutions for our urban problems in the Philippines, and I've talked about this with my fellow members at the Philippine Institute of Environmental Planner. Our problem is that we need to put together a knowledge base which comes from research and studying the mistakes we've done in the last 50 years, copying Western templates and trying to apply them to urban development. And coupled with, of course, for those of you economists know that the mistakes of economic frameworks, starting with the Bretton Woods twins, then it's highly complicated, but it's all interconnected. So as physical planners need to listen to economic planners, and we all need to listen to social scientists to also understand the implications of what all of these mistakes have imposed on lifestyles and the quality of life, in fact, for the average Filipino, who is by now 6 out of 10 urban. Sorry, it's the wrong answer.
Yeah, I know, but it's an interesting response. There's a question here going back to Makati. How do you see the future of Makati CBD vis-a-vis BGC?
That's very interesting.
And what is your response?
You have to talk. The members of both associations are with share corporations, but you know how corporations are. They like to put up China walls and they compete against each other. Right. But really, it should be a discourse that's open to all, and eventually, of course, everyone will realize that sitting together at the table will only bring greater good for a greater number. Except that, as I said, the avenue for such openness and sharing is not there, and so you know I have no answer to that. It would be good if BGC and Makati talk together, which they are in principle. But we have to realize also the inherent limits to growth for both BGC and Makati. In terms of, if you look at the FARs of the central areas, they're maxing out close to approaching Hong Kong levels, but without the infrastructure of Hong Kong. So that's the inherent problem of density. I mean, you have good density and you have bad density, and densities can be mitigated if proper infrastructure is there. But the problem with Metro Manila is infrastructure is uneven all throughout the city, and there is nobody can give you an answer as to how the metro-wide, even just the power grid alone, sewage, and we have the two franchises of the water and sewer. Who's coordinating all of that? And nobody seems to be answerable and accountable. And so your initiatives for improvement can only focus on things that are in your backyard. So I can't blame, it's a complicated
Understand.
situation. But unless we embrace the complication, we won't have any answers, right?
Agree. Arnold, we have time for one last question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. This is my final question. In your opinion, in which city is there the ideal CBD?
In the Philippines,
Outside of the Philippines.
they're all distinctive. Everything is for me as a physical planner is site dependent and culture dependent. And so the answer to that, the best CBD is the CBD that you all envisioned and plan for yourselves. And the best city is one that is the city you want to live in. And if that conversation is open in your city and you can contribute to that, then you will get that city. Hong Kong and Singapore and Seoul are slightly or highly centralized planning, but participatory design is gaining ground. So there are various lessons to learn from our neighbors, which we should try and apply, but we need to have that feedback loop to be able to adjust our strategies and our solutions. But we have to start by opening the conversation amongst all the parties involved.
Or the stakeholders. But I still want to know from you, what would be your 1 and 2 best cities? CBDs or cities?
I lived for 12 years in Singapore, so I'm a little biased.
Okay.
I had an office, a satellite office in Kuala Lumpur, but I found it less livable than, especially when it started Putrajaya and things got a little off. And, and Hong Kong, I never lived there, but it does work, and there are certain things that the Hong Kong city government does well. Jakarta is a mess, but it's an interesting mess. But it does have a larger core of heritage structures still conserved compared to Manila. And Central Manila still has. So at the end of the day, if you look at Metro Manila, it's really distinctive, and you can build for the future of Metro Manila by embracing the fact that it is multi-centered. You have satellite CBDs, but the solution is connectivity. Now the connectivity is also digital, by mobility, by land use planning, so that your transport infrastructure is coordinated. There is hope, but we have to start from embracing the mess and understanding that it will take a lot of effort from all of us to understand the mess first before we can find solutions to solve it.
So maybe you can answer the question that you initially, which is the best city in the Philippines? Sorry for putting pressure on you.
Then I have to answer no city, because we can only improve those cities we have. What I can say is, and I've asked similar questions, is that the secondary cities, anything past Metro Manila, Metro Cebu, Metro Davao, Metro Baguio, are easier animals to tame compared to all these metro areas. So long as you have only 3 or 4 LGUs in your metro area, then your problems are probably more easier to tackle. You can address planning, land use planning, transport infrastructure, etc. Cities like Bacolod, Iloilo, Tagbilaran, secondary cities all the way down to even CDO, Gensan. it's easier. So you can pick your battles if you want to choose. But the problem is, of course, you cannot negate the reality of the metro areas as generating income, generating economic, generating capital, and opportunities are still there. So it's not that I advise to focus just on the secondary and tertiary cities. It's just that my advice to them is do not follow Manila. And then realize that you need to avoid all of the mistakes that Metro Manila has made. And then for Metro Manila, Metro Cebu, and the large metro areas is to sit down and like I said, look at it from a more comprehensive point of view, and get comprehensive planning embedded in the process.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you, Paulo, for a very interesting discussion today. We could actually have a part 2 because there are a lot of questions unrelated to Makati, for the rest of the
I've seen them. There's a lot here from, and some people, some
unrelated to
mine
Makati.
also.
So anyway, that ends our lecture series, the 7th lecture series today. And we'd like to thank everyone for staying on. And we'd like to see you in the future series lectures that we will be having, and just await for announcements from the MAP Secretariat. Thank you, Paulo. It was good to meet you, and look forward to future, encounter, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Boots, and thank you to everyone, Eddie Up and Arnold, and the team over at the Management Association of the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good night to all.
Good
And
night.
have a nice dinner. Thank you.
Thank you, Architect. Thank you, Ms. Boots.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone.
I could have gone on and on, but I was conscious of time. There were a lot of interesting questions actually. Oh, they're asking, Salamat, part 2, please. Okay.
Well, you could invite other people in my circle that have a lot of interesting things, especially
Who would those be?
especially some of the younger planners that are using data-driven planning initiatives.
Yeah, that should be an interesting.
Leo Poco and Rob C for the transport.
Okay.
There's a young generation that are much less constrained by thinking of us older guys, but they have a lot of interesting things to contribute. Also because they're younger graduates.
And they're exposed also.
But of programs overseas that have already acknowledged that, like I said, the problems here in Asia are different.
Yeah.
And so they're mentored by professors that are more open to and afraid of the bias of the North-South thing, and
exactly.
and so forth. So they bring a different flavor to the conversation.
Right.
What we older guys bring is our understanding of the history of things, because there's always a reason for why things are the way they are. And hopefully my exposition of Makati's history shows that decisions are made sometimes because of happenstance. It's fate, it's the war, it's who the leader was or who died. If you read the history of cities like I do, it's very interesting that it really depends on fateful events, like the fires in Chicago and London, the earthquake of San Francisco in 2005. And I'm an urban historian, so my view is always the long jury, the long context of.
But we could not have appreciated why Makati is what it is had you not. And I'm happy that you actually did that. Had you not started off, talked about the history. There's a question here where can they avail of the pictures? Are they available?
I'll upload the deck.
Okay, fine.
I mean, a lot of the pictures are from my archives, but a lot of them are public domain, except for the archives. I think in any case, there are archives from Ayala Company,
From
I think,
yeah.
but only one or two. I don't think they mind, and it really shows the history of it. I mean, yeah, because if you ask people what the history of their places are in Metro Manila, a lot of them don't know.
That's true.
Are they still
Okay.
online? Why are there still 51 people in the
And they're listening to our conversation.
listening to our conversation? Buti na lang, hindi tayo
I didn't realize that
But it's
too.
really very interesting if I put all the chismis involved, and it's very interesting.
Well,
when I get together with some of the other urban historians and we talk about all the chismis about things happened and why they happened, like the history of the first overpass in Manila was because of Quezon wanting to visit his querida faster than the train crossing that stopped him at the
I didn't want to delve into that, unless I cross somebody.
No, but it's all part of history. So
It's all part of history.
I mean,
Unwritten history.
well, yeah, I've written about some of that, and my model really is Ambeto Campo, who is
yeah, right.
very accessible.
There's a
So-
comment here. Oh, juicy. Anyway, Arnold, maybe we could think about really part 2 maybe next year.
Yes,
Diba?
yes, please call in Robsy, Leo
Yeah,
Proco,
okay.
some of the guys over at if you want further historical perspective, the original head of MMDA, which is Dinky Einstein, is a very very interesting takes on what's currently happening, and he's the one who was actually there. I mean, I was still a young student when he was in charge of the MMDA, and all the stories of how he tried to guide Metro Manila's development with his team of very young people. In fact, very interestingly, he had suggested to redefine the boundaries of the 17 into just 5 in Metro Manila. Because if you look at it from a governance point of view and a management point of view,
right, agree.
it's so badly inefficient to manage 17
kingdoms.
There's a very wide disparity in sizes and populations.
And even income,
And income, it just does not make sense.
Mhm.
So he went through an exercise of trying to redraw the boundaries of the 17 into just 5, defined mostly by very strong boundaries of, say, like EDSA, the radials, no? And from a management point of view, if you're trying to manage resources and look at services and supply chains, that's the interesting from a planning point of view. The interesting templates to use that are practical are the templates drawn by companies like Jollibee and McDonald's in terms of their supply chain districts. So for us planners, there's a lot to be learned from business, because the industrial management side of business also impacts on physical realities. And movement of goods and people, you'll have to talk to Dr. Corpus. You can invite him. He used to be the chief planner of
I know him. His name escapes me.
Yeah, Art Corpus, Dr. Art Corpus,
the son of Odi. Yeah, I know
the son
him
of
quite well.
Audrey is my old classmate, but he has wonderful angles.
He still sits in the Ayala board.
Yes, he does, but well, that could restrain him from being too public. But he was the one who also pointed me towards a career in planning, and that's over 20 years ago. Because originally I was a landscape architect. I still am, but then
what's your famous landscape work?
The Esplanade, locally.
The Iloilo?
Yeah.
Oh, I used to go to Iloilo monthly because I sat in the board of a bank there, and I used to run in the Esplanade.
Yeah.
And I saw the development, but because I would initially stay in Hotel del Rio, because that was the only one available there for, like, I was traveling there for 11 years, and then Seda. But I found Del Rio more convenient to go to the Esplanade, you know. And I saw how it, you know, started this and then extended and extended, you know.
But most of my other work is really focused on Makati's pedestrian improvement. And if you go to Singapore,
Yeah.
we
Yeah,
did a lot of work for National Parks Board. So I designed a number of parks there. I was involved in the Singapore River and certain portions of it.
okay.
And so that's 12 years of my life there. But that was my base for most of Southeast Asia. I used to fly up and down Malaysia all the time.
Malaysia, right?
So
Yeah.
we did mostly private.
Actually, I could go on and on to talk to you, but
Yes, it's
talking
dinner time.
about lesson you know, the Putrajayas and what else? What else? In Indonesia, they have a similar attempt, right? Or did they? Was there a similar attempt in Malaysia?
It's in Myanmar.
In Myanmar, right? Yeah, because I am quite familiar with all of these countries.
It's Putrajaya in Malaysia. I forget the name in Myanmar. It's Canberra in Australia. And for us here, it would be New Clark City.
By the way, I have to ask you this question. I hope. Oh, there's still 45 people listening. I actually was a chair and director of BCDA, and it was during our term that the Clark City was. We actually started it. What are your views?
Clark Green City, when it was still named Clark Green City with...
Right, that was us. That was our board.
Okay, you and Arnel.
And I was at Arnel, yeah. I was the chair on the last few years. So what did you think? What do you think of that? In fact, there was a question in the floor about let's stop developing, places like Escolta and, support Makati, what you call this Makati, and then, let's abandon, so to speak.
We can't abandon the old districts because, you see, the greenest building is actually the one still standing. When you do the equations for how green a building is, it's a concept of embedded energy. There was energy put into the building when you first build it, and if you demolish it, you lose that embedded energy and the investment originally. You can't write it off. Not when you do the equations for greenness. It's not like accounting where things are written off.
I'm an accountant, by the way.
Because you don't lose it. Energy does not just disappear.
Right?
It's still accounted for. And so, and if you abandon heritage structures and sites,
right,
then you abandon your past and your history. And that sets you apart because it's specific to you. We all had relatives or people we knew.
And that's what Singapore is quite good at, preserving the.
Not at the start. Until the 80s, they didn't care.
Yeah.
But when reports came in 81 or 82 that their tourism receipts were going down, they did a survey and they found out that people weren't going to Singapore because it was losing its distinctiveness. They were tearing down the shop houses and all this.
Right.
And so they did a 180.
Revival.
And they then conserved areas, a bit heavy-handed and top-down, but they were able to conserve and the old Singapore very artificially at first, but now a bit more, a bit better.
Yeah.
So we still have potential of doing the same thing with old parts of Manila. In fact, even old parts of Makati, Poblacion.
Yeah, right.
Yes. And
realized that the church was there that long time ago because I attend the 6 a.m. live stream mass from San Piro, and they call the area San Piro.
Yes, right? San Piro, and people don't realize that there's a plaza of Cristo del Rey.
Yeah.
And that Cristo del Rey Plaza used to have stone steps that led all the way to the Pasig because people would come to the church in pilgrimage and to Guadalupe through the Pasig River. And you can still trace that. And we were involved with initiatives for Poblacion, which could be brought into the fold of development, albeit different from central business Makati.
Yeah.
by embracing the heritage that it has.
Yeah, keep the character, no?
Yes, the characters there, reconfiguring the streets to shared streets,
Right.
using the concept of poor nerve, addressing some of the issues of access and, I hate to say it, parking. And then also the pedestrian connectivity of that district with central Makati, because it's not part of Masaya. There's no real interest to connect to them, but of course, it would, I believe, benefit everyone if we crossed Buendia and connect our very good system in central Makati with Poblacion and the rest of all the Makati.
Before we split, there was an interesting comment from the audience which I didn't notice. I can't ask question po. Ramong ang left the group po. Ha 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 ha. Thank you for this lecture.
You mean he didn't stay? He didn't find my talk interesting? Maybe he left when I mentioned Parex. I didn't know.
Maybe when you mentioned Parex. Anyway, I guess we have to end this. AM Arnold, there was a request now. If do we upload the recording to the? Can you cut the recording up to the point where I officially ended the program?
Yes.
You're going to
we will do
upload it to the. There's a request now to upload. Do we do that?
Yes, actually, you can use the same link in watching
Yeah,
again.
but can you please
Yes, we will.
end it at the
We will.
point our informal conversation not included.
Okay, we will do that. We will do
Okay.
that.
Oh,
Anyway.
I just have to answer one question from a friend of mine in Singapore, David T, about golf courses in Metro Manila.
Okay. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, eminent domain. Yes, if you look at Metro Manila from the air, the only large open spaces
Or
are
the golf space.
golf courses, military camps, and the cemeteries. So the only people who have access to open green space really are military officials, the dead, and the elite. And I forgot the mental institution and
Mental health.
mentally challenged. Those are
The
only
mentally
people
challenged.
that access to open space in Manila. The rest of us have to go overseas or to Batangas or somewhere else for our open.
Go out of town. Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you very much.
Paolo. Good to meet you.
Okay.
Enjoyed this
stay safe,
conversation.
everyone. Okay.
Sige. Salamat,
Invite me
Arnold.
again. And let's make sure Mr. Ang stays. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.